It was 2 in the morning when the door creaked open and a sharp light flooded the room. My mother's voice came through the silence like a command from something higher. Clean it. Now. I remember thinking she'd lost her mind. Clothes were everywhere. The smell of dust and old books filled the air. I was half asleep, angry, confused. But she didn't move. She just stood there, in the doorway, calm and unshaken. I picked up a shirt, then another. By the time I realized, I was cleaning like my life depended on it. That night, I thought I was fixing a mess on the floor, but I was really fixing a mess in my mind. You're watching Napoleon Hill Stories, a channel inspired by the lessons and experiences that shaped Napoleon Hill's philosophy of success and inner growth. If stories like this inspire you, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, what's one habit that changed your life forever? When I was 17, my world was small. A single dim room at the end of a narrow hallway, walls painted in a color that had long forgotten its name. The air always smelled of dust and late-night snacks, the window half covered by a curtain that hadn't been washed in years. It wasn't just messy, it was alive with neglect. Clothes slept on the floor, books lay open like abandoned thoughts, and somewhere under all that chaos was a guitar that hadn't been tuned in months. My room was my reflection, loud, confused, unfinished. My mother used to say, "How you do anything is how you do everything." I didn't understand her then. To me, those words sounded like the kind of things adults say to make themselves feel wise. I believed discipline was the enemy of creativity, that routine killed passion, that order was for people who were afraid to dream. I wanted to live freely. No alarms, no schedules, no rules. But freedom without structure is just another kind of prison. Back then, I thought success was about talent. I'd spend hours imagining myself on a stage, playing music, hearing applause. Yet I never practiced long enough to finish a song. I told myself I was waiting for inspiration, but really, I was hiding from effort. My days blended into nights. The same playlist, the same endless scroll on my phone, the same promise that tomorrow I'll start. And every tomorrow became another wasted day. My mother noticed. Mothers always do. She didn't lecture me, not at first. She just looked at my room, then at me, and sighed. Sometimes she'd quietly leave the door open, like she hoped that one day I'd let the light in by choice. But I never did. The door stayed shut, the air stayed stale, and my mind grew heavier. One evening, I came home late. She was sitting by the kitchen table, silent, her hands folded. She didn't ask where I'd been. She just said, "You've lost your rhythm." I laughed it off. Rhythm was for music, not life. But that sentence stuck in my mind like a note I couldn't stop hearing. She didn't mean the rhythm of sound. She meant the rhythm of being. The balance between chaos and control. Days turned into weeks. I skipped school, skipped meals, and skipped opportunities. I avoided mirrors because I couldn't stand the reflection. I had become a spectator in my own life, watching time pass, waiting for something to save me. The more I ignored the disorder, the louder it spoke. Every pile of clothes felt heavier. Every object out of place whispered guilt. Still, I refused to listen. Then came that night. It was cold, the kind of night where silence feels alive. The clock had just crossed 2 in the morning when I heard the soft creak of my door. The light flicked on, and there she was, standing in her robe, eyes tired but steady. "Clean it. Now." Those words didn't sound angry. They sounded final, like a verdict. I tried to argue, but she didn't answer. She just pointed once, firmly, to the floor. For a few seconds, I stood there frozen. Then, out of something between guilt and defiance, I began to move. I picked up a shirt. It smelled like old sweat and forgotten effort. Then another. Then I started folding. Somewhere between resentment and exhaustion, something shifted. The rhythm she talked about. It started to return, one fold at a time. As I moved around the room, I began to see details I hadn't noticed before. A photo of me and her when I was a child, smiling with missing teeth. A ticket from my first concert. A notebook filled with ideas for songs that were never written. It felt like I was cleaning the layers of my own history. Each item carried a fragment of who I was supposed to become, someone I had left behind. My anger faded, replaced by something quieter, awareness. I started to see how every piece of clutter mirrored a piece of procrastination, how every mess represented a decision postponed. The room wasn't messy because I was lazy, it was messy because I was lost. It was easier to ignore the floor than to face myself. Easier to live in confusion than to take responsibility. At some point, I looked up and realized she was still there, not saying a word, just watching. Her expression had softened. For a moment, I thought she might say something kind, but she didn't. She just nodded, a small nod that said, "I know you understand now." Then she turned off the hallway light and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet hum of the lamp. As the minutes turned into hours, I found myself cleaning with focus I didn't know I had. The floor became visible again. The air felt lighter. My mind, too. I understood something simple yet profound. External order creates internal peace. The more I organized the room, the more I could think clearly. By the time I finished, I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. That night, something invisible inside me clicked. I realized that I'd been waiting for motivation, when what I needed was movement. Motivation doesn't come before action, it comes after. Discipline, I learned, isn't about control, it's about alignment. You don't clean a room because you love cleaning. You do it because it's a mirror of your mind. And as the lamp flickered softly, I sat down on the edge of the bed, hands covered in dust, heart strangely calm. The world outside was still dark, but inside that little room, I felt the first light of clarity. My mother hadn't forced me to clean. She had forced me to meet myself, and that was the beginning of everything that came after. By the time the clock struck 3, the room looked halfway alive again. The air no longer smelled of sleep and defeat. It smelled of effort, that faint, human scent of movement after long stillness. I sat there for a moment, staring at the small patch of clean floor I had made, and for some reason, I felt both proud and ashamed. Proud that I'd finally done something. Ashamed that it had taken my mother's voice to wake me up. But as I kept cleaning, the silence grew heavier. Every object I picked up seemed to speak back to me, a conversation I had avoided for years. The old guitar in the corner leaned against the wall like an accusation. Its strings were covered in dust, but I could almost hear the echoes of songs I never finished. Next to it was a pile of notebooks, lyrics, unfinished ideas, scribbles of dreams that had once meant everything. I opened one. On the first page, written in black ink that had faded into gray, were words I barely recognized as my own handwriting. I will practice every day. I will play on a stage one day. The promise hit me like a punch in the chest. I closed the notebook quickly, as if the words were too loud to look at. The truth was simple, brutal, and impossible to escape. I had betrayed myself. Not because I lacked time or opportunity, but because I lacked order. My dreams had drowned in clutter long before reality could kill them. It's strange how the mind starts talking when everything else is quiet. As I folded another shirt, I started hearing her voice again. My mother, not in that moment, but through the years. If you can't manage your space, you'll never manage your mind. I had always rolled my eyes at that. But now, surrounded by the evidence of my own indiscipline, it felt like a prophecy fulfilled. Around 3:30 a.m., I found a small wooden box under the bed. Inside were a few old things, a birthday card from my father, a broken watch, and a photo of me as a child standing between them. My father had left when I was 10. He wasn't cruel, he was just absent. A dreamer who chased things that never stayed. Maybe that's why I grew to fear commitment. Maybe I thought if I didn't start, I couldn't fail. But as I held that photo under the yellow lamplight, I saw something else. Both of them smiling at me like they believed I could do anything. And the question that burned in my mind was simple. What would they think of who I've become? The shame was heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like a low hum in the back of my head. I wanted to escape it, but there was nowhere to go. The room had become a mirror. Every corner reflected something I didn't want to see, my wasted time, my half-hearted attempts, my quiet surrender. I realized then that the mess wasn't the problem. The mess was the proof. For a long while, I just stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by everything I owned and nothing I truly valued. The weight of it pressed against my chest. I felt small, smaller than I had ever felt before. I remember whispering, "What am I doing with my life?" It wasn't a question for anyone else. It was for me. And then, something unexpected happened. I started crying. Not out of sadness, but out of exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. It was as if the weight of years had suddenly found its moment to collapse. I didn't fight it. I let it come. Tears fell quietly onto the floor I had just cleaned, leaving dark spots on the wood. It was messy, ironic, and perfect. In that moment, I wasn't cleaning a room. I was unlearning years of avoidance. As the clock ticked toward 4, I picked up the last pile of clothes and noticed a piece of paper underneath. It was a small slip torn from a notebook, yellowed at the edges. On it, written in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "Success begins the moment you decide to take control of your surroundings." I didn't remember when she had written that. Maybe she had left it for me long ago, or maybe it had fallen out of something I'd forgotten. But those words felt alive. They glowed under the lamplight like a message sent through time. That was when I finally understood. She hadn't woken me up to clean. She had woken me up to begin. I looked around the room again, now half clean, half chaotic. The division was almost perfect, one side light, one side dark. It looked like a map of my life. The left side, the part one had cleaned, felt like peace. The right side, untouched and heavy with clutter, looked like everything I hadn't faced yet. Fear, doubt, hesitation. For the first time, I wanted to finish it. Not because she told me to, but because I needed to. I started moving faster. Fold, stack, throw away, organize. My movements became rhythmic, mechanical, like meditation. I realized how powerful it feels to act with purpose, even in something as small as cleaning. It's not about the act itself, it's about reclaiming control. Napoleon Hill once wrote, "Discipline begins with mastering your thoughts." If you don't control what you think, you can't control what you do. That night, I learned that thought and action are mirrors. The more I acted with intention, the clearer my mind became. When the last object was finally in place, I turned off the light and stood in the quiet. The room was clean, completely clean, but the real silence wasn't in the air, it was inside me. I felt empty, but not in a bad way. More like the kind of emptiness that comes right before you start filling yourself with something new. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The cracks in the plaster looked different now. The same imperfections, but they no longer bothered me. Maybe that's what discipline does. It doesn't erase imperfection. It gives it meaning. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized something profound. Every failure I had blamed on luck or fate had really been the result of my own disorder. Every dream that didn't bloom had been planted in chaos. That night wasn't about punishment. It was initiation, the first step toward a life of awareness. I didn't know it yet, but that small act of obedience had shifted the axis of my existence. The world outside was still dark, but I could feel dawn somewhere deep within me. And as I finally closed my eyes, one final thought settled quietly in my mind. That maybe the greatest turning points in life don't come with applause or fireworks, but with a whisper at 2 in the morning, telling you to get up and clean your room. When the morning finally arrived, it didn't burst through the window. It crept in quietly, almost shyly, like it was testing whether it was welcome there. The light moved across the floor, golden and patient, touching every surface I had fought to reclaim. The room was still small, still imperfect, but it breathed now. For the first time in years, it felt like a space that belonged to someone awake. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed that had witnessed years of excuses, and looked around. Every corner looked new, but I knew it wasn't the room that had changed, it was me. I could feel something deeper, a stillness inside that was both fragile and powerful. The chaos that had once filled my mind had quieted. It hadn't disappeared completely, but it was now under my watch, not the other way around. My mother came in just as the light reached the far wall. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she just looked. Her eyes scanned every corner like she was checking if the message had reached me. And when they did, she nodded once. That single nod was all the approval I needed. No lecture, no praise, just silent acknowledgement, a passing of understanding from one generation to the next. Then she turned and left, closing the door gently behind her. That small gesture felt like the closing of a chapter. I realized she wasn't teaching me about chores or tidiness. She was teaching me about energy, how everything around you holds the reflection of who you are inside. Disorder isn't just visual, it's spiritual. When you allow chaos to stay around you, you give it permission to live within you. I looked at my desk and noticed a small piece of paper stuck under a glass cup. It was an old quote I had written months ago and forgotten. Your outer world is a mirror of your inner world. At that moment, the words didn't feel philosophical. They felt like truth carved into stone. That was the law I had broken for years without realizing it. I decided to open the window. Cold morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. It mixed with the faint smell of dust and soap. I inhaled deeply, and it felt like I was breathing for the first time. The street outside was waking up, a distant car, a barking dog, the metallic creak of someone rolling a shutter open. I used to ignore mornings. Now, it felt like I had earned this one. Something changed in how I saw time that day. Before, I lived waiting to feel inspired, waiting to feel ready, waiting for a sign. But readiness never arrives. You have to summon it. The night had taught me that order is not the result of clarity, it's the cause of it. You don't clean because you feel like it. You clean so that you can start feeling again. I made a new list that morning, not of dreams or goals, but of disciplines, small, measurable acts that I could control. Wake up early. Read 10 pages. Keep your space clean. Finish one task before starting another. They weren't grand. They weren't exciting. But for the first time, they felt real. And when I looked at that list, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt anchored. I made my bed with precision, smoothed every wrinkle, lined up the pillow. It was almost ritualistic. The more I moved with purpose, the more powerful I felt. Not in an egoistic way, but in a grounded, centered way. I realized that discipline wasn't the opposite of freedom. It was its foundation. Freedom without order is chaos. Order without freedom is imprisonment. True mastery lies in balancing both. Throughout the day, I kept noticing small differences. My thoughts came slower, but sharper. My movements felt intentional. I even found myself humming, something I hadn't done in months. That small act, the one my mother demanded at 2 in the morning, had rearranged the architecture of my mind. I began to understand what Napoleon Hill meant when he wrote that every act of self-control strengthens your character like a muscle. That morning, I had just taken the first rep. A few days later, I found myself at my guitar again. The dust was gone. The strings gleamed under the sunlight. I picked it up and started playing without thinking. My fingers stumbled, but the sound was alive. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for once, I didn't stop midway. I played until my hands hurt, until the song existed. That simple act felt sacred. Creation, I realized, flows best through order. Weeks passed. My mother stopped checking my room. She didn't need to. The habit had already rooted itself in me. The discipline had spread like sunlight through my days, from how I spoke to how I thought, from how I handled setbacks to how I faced silence. The room had been just the beginning. I began to notice patterns everywhere. The way my thoughts scattered when my desk did. The way I felt anxious when I let my routine slip. The connection between inner focus and outer structure became undeniable. I wasn't chasing motivation anymore. I was building momentum. There's a difference. Motivation waits for you to feel inspired. Momentum moves whether you want it to or not. And with that realization came peace. I no longer saw discipline as something external, forced upon me. It became internal, a rhythm, like the heartbeat of a calm, determined life. The same way you don't need to think about breathing, I wanted discipline to become instinct. Because when discipline becomes natural, success becomes inevitable. One afternoon, months later, I asked my mother why she had done it. Why that night? Why in that way? She smiled and said, "Because I couldn't talk to the man you were becoming, but I could make him move." Her words hit me like lightning. That was love, not the gentle, comforting kind, but the fierce kind that wakes you up in the middle of the night and makes you face your reflection. From that moment, I carried her lesson everywhere. Before every project, every new chapter, I clean my space. I clear the table, I align my tools, I breathe. It's my ritual, my way of saying to the universe, I am ready. That morning after the longest night of my life, I finally understood what Napoleon Hill meant when he said, "There is a difference between wishing for a thing and being ready to receive it." Readiness, I learned, is not a feeling, it's a state of order. You don't get ready by thinking. You get ready by preparing. And all it took to discover that truth was a voice at 2:07 a.m., a messy room, and the courage to begin. Years passed, and that small, ordinary night became the silent cornerstone of everything that came after. I often think about it when I'm sitting at my desk, now covered with notebooks, plans, and projects, all neatly aligned. There's still chaos in my life sometimes, of course. The world doesn't stop being unpredictable, but I learned that inner order gives you strength to face outer storms. Without it, even small problems feel heavy. With it, even mountains feel manageable. I built my career on principles I didn't even know I was learning that night. Responsibility, rhythm, focus. I started treating every task, no matter how small, like it mattered, because it does. The world rewards attention to detail. A messy desk leads to a messy mind, and a messy mind leads to messy results. But when your space is clear, your mind sharpens. You stop reacting and start creating. There were days, later in life, when opportunities came suddenly, interviews, deals, invitations. And every time, people told me, "You always seem prepared." But the truth is, I wasn't lucky or naturally organized. I had trained for readiness without knowing it. Every morning, I made my bed. Every night, I reset my desk. It was never about neatness. It was about energy. I understood that preparation is faith in motion. It's you saying to life, "I'm ready for what's next." Sometimes, discipline feels lonely. People mistake it for obsession or control. But it's not about being perfect. It's about respecting yourself enough to not live in chaos. I used to think freedom was doing whatever I wanted. Now I know freedom is being able to face whatever comes, and that begins with discipline. That night, my mother taught me that order is a language, one that the universe understands. Every time I walk into my home now, I can tell who I am just by looking around. If my table is cluttered, I know I've lost balance. If my shelves are dusty, I know I've stopped paying attention. My surroundings speak before I do. They tell the truth I sometimes hide from myself. And when that happens, I do the same thing I did years ago. I start cleaning. Slowly, quietly, with gratitude. It's not about the dust. It's about the dialogue between me and my own mind. I once read that Napoleon Hill believed the mind is like a garden. It will grow whatever you plant, weeds or roses alike. That night, I realized my room was that garden. For years, I had been watering weeds, excuses, distractions, noise. Cleaning it was the first act of weeding my life. And since then, I've learned to choose my seeds more carefully. Every great transformation begins in silence. Mine began in the sound of a broom sweeping the floor at 3 a.m. That's the paradox of growth. It often hides inside the ordinary. A light turned on, a voice saying clean, a moment that felt meaningless but carried the weight of destiny. We rarely recognize our turning points when they happen. They don't arrive with applause or revelation. They come as whispers, nudging us to move. Sometimes I imagine what my mother must have thought, standing in that doorway, watching her stubborn son finally obey. Maybe she knew it would be years before I understood. Maybe she trusted the lesson would bloom in its own time. She's older now, her hair gray, her voice softer. But every time I visit, she still notices everything, the details, the order. One evening, she smiled at me and said, "You always kept your room clean." I smiled back and said, "You have no idea." Because the truth is, I still wake up some mornings and feel that same voice in my head. Not hers anymore, but mine, saying, "Clean it." And it's never just about the room. It's about the meeting I've been avoiding, the project I've been delaying, the thought I've been neglecting. Cleaning has become my way of resetting. It's meditation through motion. Discipline doesn't end when the task is done. It begins again every day you choose to live with intention. The hardest part isn't starting once. It's starting again and again and again. But with each repetition, you grow stronger, quieter, more certain. Discipline becomes identity. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is silent and the world feels heavy, I turn off all the lights except one. I sit in the glow and look around, remembering that small version of myself, lost, tired, surrounded by clutter, and I whisper, "Thank you." Because without that night, I might still be sleeping through my own life. Order is not the goal. It's the doorway. Through it, you meet your real self, the part that listens, creates, and builds. The part that can face the unknown and say, "I'm ready." So tonight, before you sleep, take a look around your space. Is it silent or screaming? Is it supporting your dreams or suffocating them? Because the truth is, your room, your desk, your habits, they all speak your future before you do. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that small steps build great destinies. And tell me in the comments, what's the one thing in your life you'll put in order tonight? Because discipline doesn't start tomorrow. It starts the moment you decide that you're ready to live awake.